Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. I have someone special with me who's going to give us a sneak preview into the history of India and China, a contentious region which has been at odds with each other for a long time, especially 1962. Sir, thank you so much, firstly, for taking the time out. You're an author, a journalist, and an authority, if I may, on especially on this 1962 war and, of course, Myanmar. Which is something that we should be able to look at with you in a little later. But today's subject is going to be on the China and India conflict of 1962 and the situations around that particular conflict, because there is a lot of difference of opinion, if I may, about how that conflict started and what is the end result and how did it affect the entire game between India and China. So, firstly, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Well,
I, sir,
okay.
please, please.
Well, for many years, Neville Maxwell's India-China war dominated the narrative, and according to him it was Nero's forward policy, where India actually went up and to secure what India thought the border should be along the McNaughton line, and primarily in Arunachal Pradesh, but also was in Kashmir. And that, in turn, would have then provoked the Chinese to counterattack, as the Chinese put it themselves. I mean, this doesn't make sense at all. But first of all, if you look at the nature of the war, uh, Nero's forward policy was launched less than a year before the Chinese attacked. And if you look at the nature of the attack, it's nothing that could have been put together in a couple of months or even a year. It would take years of preparations. But in the Chinese, when they attacked, were extremely well prepared. They moved tens of thousands of troops through the most difficult terrain in the world, even more difficult in those days than it is today. And they were included heavy artillery, guns, people had been adjusted to high altitude warfare. And they also made other preparations. I mean, from John Delvey when he was captured, that he was taken to a prisoner of war camp, but their tents had already been erected to accommodate about 1,000 prisoners of war. And they brought in interpreters who spoke a variety of Indian languages. And apart from that, you can also see where the Chinese attacked. It was not all over Arunachal, as many people think, and they did not go all the way down to the Brahmaputra Valley. There were basically three areas. There was Taiwan in south, in the west, and there was Wallong in the east, and then another small area in the center. But these areas where the Chinese have been collecting intelligence for years before the attack began. So, I mean, it is very clear that this was something that China had planned for a very long time. It was not something provoked by Nero's forward policy. It wasn't even about the border where it should be. There were other reasons why the Chinese decided to launch this war in 1962.
What
And
those reasons? What would those reasons be, sir?
well, I can say three major reasons. One was the turning point, really, 1959, when India accepted the Dalai Lama and gave them asylum in India, and it was allowed to set up a government in exile, first in Missouri and later on in McLeod about Dharamsala. And already in March 1959, shortly after the Lhasa uprising, and even before the Dalai Lama had reached India, there was a meeting with the Chinese Communist Party, the top leaders, where both Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping said that when the time comes, we certainly will settle accounts with them, meaning the Indians. It was clear that at that time they started to plan something. And if you look at it 3 years, yeah, that's what it would take to prepare for what happened in 1962. But then there were two other reasons as well. One was domestic reasons in China. Mao Zedong had launched what he called the Great Leap Forward in 1958. It was a complete disaster. Millions of people died from starvation. The economy was on the verge of collapse, and so was society as a whole. And in that, Mao Zedong was actually almost on his way out. There were many people in the leadership of the Communist Party who wanted to have him dismissed. And in a situation like that, it is quite normal in a way, that you select a outside enemy, an outside threat, and unite the nation, the army, and the party behind that perceived threat. And of course, that was India. And in a way, you can say that Mao succeeded. He, after the 62 war, he re-emerged in a way, re-established his position as the paramount leader of China and the Communist Party, and needed even more to solidify his grip on power, and then came later on the Cultural Revolution. So these domestic problems had more to do with the war than any foreign or forward policy that Nero had launched before the war. And the third reason is, of course, that if you look at it in a broader perspective, in the 1950s, India was the main voice among the newly independent countries in Asia and in Africa. India initiated the Bandung Conference in 1955, the birth of the non-aligned movement, and so on. And there was even in India, they managed to get China to come and attend the meeting in Bandung. But China, of course, had a different worldview. They didn't believe in non-alignment. China wanted to be, the leader of world revolution. And in order, the leader of the so-called liberation movements across what was later to be known as the Third World. But in order to achieve their position, they had to throw India from this elevated position of being the leader of the non-aligned movement. And if you see what happened after 62, yes, China succeeded in doing that. India was humiliated. Nero died a broken man a couple of years later. And Mao's China suddenly became, almost the role model for many of the liberation movement in the Third World, even in Latin America, and of course in Asia and in Africa. So if you put those three reasons together, that is, you have an explanation to why there was a war in 1962. It was not about the border. There was an excuse. It was a pretext.
That is pretty much away from the conventional wisdom, if I may, of the history of the 62 war. You mentioned Maxwell, who's also given his version of what the events happened. Your version is basically the other way around. And how, if I may, how did you arrive at that particular thought process?
Well, I was interested in the border conflict when I was actually very young. I was only 14 years old. I was living in Sweden at that time. And this is in 1967. So I wrote to the Indian embassy in Stockholm and asked them for material they possibly had about the war. So I got a whole box full of white papers with folded out maps and detailed descriptions of the border demarcation, the history behind the border, and so on. And I was quite impressed. And later on, I read Neville Maxwell's book and thought that maybe he's right. I mean, this seems, quite reasonable. But then, the more I thought about it, it didn't make sense for the reasons I just mentioned. And then I also began to scrutinize Neville Maxwell's book, and I looked at his footnotes. And by then, I had actually managed to get hold of a lot of literature that he referred to. And I found out that his footnotes refer to certain works, documents, and so on. But those documents did not say what Maxwell claimed they did. He actually falsified sources. And that is when I became even more intrigued by the whole issue. And I decided to write my own book, which I called China's India War.
I've not yet fully read the book, but the end of it, the right at the beginning, your the way that you've put across the situation is actually completely the opposite of what we've actually come to know as the conventional history of Indian China war. Let's talk about Arunachal, sir. What exactly happened there? What was the Chinese purpose? And did they come close to achieving that purpose, or were they in an overwhelming unpreparedness of India was their victory rather than them achieving what they came out to do?
Well, it was a victory in the sense that they did defeat the Indian defense in what was then Nefa and Arunachal. And there's been a lot of speculations as to why they withdrew unilaterally and declared a ceasefire. And many people assume that's because winter was approaching. Supply lines from Tibet down to the positions they captured would be too long and too vulnerable and difficult to maintain. But honestly, I don't believe that either, because there is a declassified CIA report about air transport, which I read before I wrote my book. And it shows that, I mean, India had a abandoned test board, right? And this is an area where the Chinese were actually very close to the Brahmaputra Valley. They could, if they wanted to, continued and marched on and captured Tezpur and the airport there. And from there to Tezpur, they could have flown in supplies from Baoshan, the air base on the other side of the what was called the hump during World War II, also then in northwestern Yunnan. And that would have been quite easy. And the CIA actually had concluded that if the Chinese wanted to stay, they could have supplied the troops by air, not overland from Tibet. It would have been too difficult. So the question is then, why did they withdraw? Well, I don't think they intended to capture territory. That was not the purpose of the whole thing. Would they really want to govern Nefa or parts of Nefa? Not really. I mean, by launching this attack and then withdrawing to the positions they held before the war, they made a point that, look, we are not the aggressor here. No, we are the nice guys here. We are not wanting to capture any kind of territory. And this served into the Chinese propaganda purpose. It was not for tactical reasons or any other reasons that they decided to withdraw. This is at least my conclusion after looking at, among other documents, is declassified CIA report on air transport.
That's an interesting perspective, actually, because a lot of people say that, I mean, the supply line story is the most sold with regards to the Chinese possession or the Chinese occupation of Nifa at that particular point of time. How would you categorize the same argument in Ladakh, sir? Because, of course, a lot of people argue that this territory was captured during the 62 war, but we know that the Chinese were in possession of this area starting
Actually,
56.
they captured Aksachin long before the 62 war. It was in the mid 50s. They built a highway from Xinjiang to Tibet, and the Indians were not even aware of it until the highway was there. So, I mean, there wasn't really any territory to capture over there. It was just to secure what China considered to be, or should be, the border between India and China at that particular area. So it's very different from the Arunachal or Nefa scene of theater.
That is again a story that is untold around this place. Now let's talk about the overall perspective. So when before the war, there was of course a lot of communication happening between both the governments. They referred to the Indo-China letters. Uh, People have written about various different perceptions of the area. They've written about a whole lot of misunderstandings, if I may use that word, that was taking place between the governments, both the governments. How do you perceive how India handled that 3 years before the Chinese actually came out to attack India? How do you see that entire
Well,
thing in context?
there's a new book by Avtar Singh Basian, published 2021, I believe, called Nero, Tibet, and China, where he actually gone through the correspondence between Zhou Enlai and Nero in detail. And it's a very thorough research book, and I have a lot of respect for his research and what he did. And his conclusion is that uh, Zhou Enlai was much more flexible than Nero, and he was willing to talk about the border, whereas Nero was more rigid in his approach and had decided, no, the border said nothing to talk about it. And they seem to believe that if Nero had been a little bit more flexible, maybe the war could have been avoided. Well, that argument fails to take into account what the Chinese actually were up to. And one shouldn't take what Zhou Enlai wrote in those letters at face value. Those were diplomatic niceties, which were meant to cover up and disguise what China was actually up to. And that was what I mentioned before. So it doesn't really make sense, because I also went through some of the Chinese language sources and discovered what the Chinese actually wrote about Nero, what they actually thought about Nero in the 1950s. And that was that he was a lackey of British imperialism. There is nothing, no diplomatic niceties there at all. So, I mean, we have to make a difference between what Chu Enlai wrote in his letters and what was actually happening in China and the actual attitudes towards India which prevailed among the communist leadership in China at the time. It was very different from what Chu Enlai wrote in his letters.
This is a similar situation to what we see today as well, sir. And
Yes.
how do you compare both the situations?
Well, if you look at the situation today, India starts has its position is quite clear, of course, and the Chinese negotiators, whenever they meet, they change their position all the time. It's never the same, which to me shows that they don't want to see a settlement there. They want to keep the issue alive because it keeps the conflict alive and it keeps India on edge all the time. And India-China relations will be kept on edge because of this unsettled, border issue. So I mean, one can't really take what the Chinese saying at face value in diplomatic letters or during negotiations. You have to go to Beijing to find out the mindset of the Chinese leadership in order to understand why China is behaving the way it does.
Sir, coming back to the war, the I mean, it is widely believed across the world that Indians did not fight. I mean, and that's something which I want to talk about is because there is the the failure was at the high levels, but the
Yes,
soldiers on the ground stood their ground and last man, last bullet.
yes,
What kind of an
absolutely.
impact, what kind of an impact did that have on the Chinese when they saw events, especially looking at Rizangla incidents in the east as well towards Tawang and many other places where the resistance given by the Indian soldiers on the ground was, I mean, quite costly to the Chinese. So how did they
Yes.
perceive this, and what lessons have they learned?
Well, Maxwell, to return to him, he refers to this classified report, Anderson Brooks report on the war, and he seems to give the impression that that report indicates that India was responsible for the war, that they somehow provoked it. And I really can't understand how I came to that conclusion because I've read that report too. That is not what it says. Again, what it says is that there was bad communication between the military and the government. And when the government had launched its forward policy, the army was not given the instruments to implement that policy. That is the contents of the Henderson Brooks report. Not that India provoked it. It doesn't even question the forward policy. It just says that the army simply did not have the means to enforce it. And that was the main problem in 1962. That the Indians didn't fight is wrong. I mean, they fought with whatever they had, and they fought bravely, and even to the last man in certain instances, in Sela Pass, for instance. And but it seemed that they did not have enough equipment, they didn't have enough ammunition, they did not have enough heavy guns. They just couldn't withstand this massive, well-planned Chinese push across the line of actual control. So there was a problem. But I mean, the soldiers over there, they fought as much as they could with whatever means they had. But the problem was that they didn't have the means to resist the Chinese invasion. And if you're talking about Chinese casualties, they've been very coy about that. And I've never seen any credible accounts of, from the Chinese side, how many people they actually lost in that war. But it's a reason to believe that those were massive. Because a very common Chinese tactics at that time and in other wars as well is this human wave policy. Right? But they did that in Korea, they did it against Vietnam later on. And that is very costly. I mean, you may achieve something there, but then hundreds of men, if not thousands of soldiers are going to die. But if you stand one way after another, it's very difficult to resist that kind of thing. So exactly how many Chinese soldiers died in Kashmir and in Nirfa in 62, we will probably never know. But I have reason to believe that casualties were extremely heavy. But the Chinese communist leadership didn't care because that was part of the tactics, human waves.
No, that's the thing, because at the end of it, till the time they don't release their casualty numbers, it's difficult to perceive because the land didn't exchange hands, and at the end of it, then it comes down to who lost the most men.
Yeah. Well, I
The
mean, who lost? I can't say, but I mean, if you look at the Indian casualty figures and compare them with what has been estimated on the Chinese side, I think that the Chinese, in terms of dead and wounded, lost many more men than India did, simply because of the tactics they used, the human waves which they send across the border.
When one looks at the contemporary history between India and China, it's always brought to light the defeat of 1962. Rarely there is a mention about 67, the
Yes,
Natula,
exactly. Yeah.
the 75 standoff,
Mhm.
the 86, 87, 89 Walong incident. Do the Chinese even consider those things when they talk about their India policy?
Well, they must, but they're not saying anything publicly. You haven't seen any statement or any reference to that. But that is actually when the Indians pushed the Chinese back and defeated the Chinese. So I mean, that shouldn't be forgotten either. And not to lie, especially was I think a bitter lesson for the Chinese. They thought India would be a walkover, as they believed it was in '62, but that did not happen. They were pushed back and defeated. And if you look at the situation today, I mean, it's very hard to say what's going to happen, and we cannot predict. But I've been up to the border, not in Ladakh, but I've been up to the border in Arunachal, and Indian defenses there are very solid. I would be very surprised if the Chinese, if they decided to launch another attack, which I doubt, but let's say that they did, there wouldn't be a repeat of '62. No way.
Of course, the times have changed and the situations have changed. That's for sure. The past 2 years have told us a little more and given us a little more depth into the reality of how the Chinese would operate on the borders with the clashes that have taken place. How do you
Yeah,
see this
well, I mean,
in
there will be these occasional clashes in the Himalayas just to keep the issue alive and so as not to let it die down. But if you're talking about a wider conflict between India and China, I don't think it's being going to be fought in the Himalayas. They need to look into the Indian Ocean. Because there, for the first time in history, the Chinese are making inroads and establishing a presence. And that is, they're moving into an area that's extremely volatile in many ways because they've got all these very poor small island states that can be easily manipulated. You got a number of foreign powers which have bases there. I mean, you got Diego Garcia, the big American base, and you got the French down in La Réunion. And then also the Chinese have established their first really permanent overseas military base in Djibouti. And if you look at it from the Chinese point of view, yes, this makes sense because most of the trade is across the Indian Ocean. There will be minerals from Africa, there will be consumer goods and other stuff going to Europe and so on, and oil from the Middle East. So naturally, China want like to provide those trade routes with a defense umbrella. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, but by doing so, they're confronting the existing powers in the Indian Ocean, and that I think is potentially much more volatile than the situation in the Himalayas. I would even argue that it's even more volatile than the conflict in the South China Sea, because there you got spy satellites and all over the place, and the Chinese cannot move 1 inch before it's recorded, and there's some kind of countermeasure. The situation in the Indian Ocean is far more unpredictable, and therefore also potentially more dangerous.
I absolutely agree with you, sir. But there's also a thought process that talks about the fact that the Chinese keep pushing us back into the Himalayas to make us remember the defeat of 1962 and keep us away from the oceans. So the predominant focus
Absolutely.
border
So
is
the two, they are linked, definitely. And I came across an article in a Chinese newspaper or magazine rather last year. Where they were talking, they actually wanted to remind India, this was in English, interestingly. They want to remind India of they call it the counter. Just a moment, I will go and get it. I think I have it here. Yeah, here we go. It's from the 13th of January last year, 2022, written by Sachi Zhang Qiaokang. And it says, today, why should we remember the self-defense counterattack on the Sino-Indian border? It's a very interesting title, isn't it? It was a self-defense counterattack. And then he goes through the war from the Chinese point of view, and he mentions, of course, that India should have learned from this and not try to provoke China again. And then he goes through and they talk about this counterattack. I mean, counterattack, there must have been an attack first, right? But India didn't attack anyone. So it's a very interesting choice of words there. But this article is actually very interesting because it shows that China is still using this issue when they want to outline its policy or its attitudes or perceptions of India. It was a self-defense counterattack, 62, and we must remember it. That's what this article says.
It's an interesting perspective when the Chinese kind of go back into history and create these, create a different narrative out of reality. I mean, I'm not trying to hide away from the reality, but the narrative is now a newer one. The Chinese
Yeah,
themselves are not 62.
what is very interesting, of course, I think also in India, there's a lot more discussions now about what happened in 62 than what I've seen for many years. More and more people are getting interested in the war, the reasons for the war, if it could have been avoided, what the different positions were, and so on. And I think this is a very healthy debate, and they should continue because it is an unsettled conflict. And as you said, it is also meant, I think, to withdraw attention from what was happening in the Indian Ocean. So the two issues are linked, and they create a much bigger geopolitical perspective on things about the current situation in Asia. Because you've got two regional superpowers here, in China and India, which are competitors. So let's face it, they are. And it's very important, I think, to study what is the Chinese mindset, what is really behind the Chinese rhetoric, because it's not always what it seems. It's not always what they say that's reality.
The Chinese are quite cryptic in their ways and means of communication. So, there is one big question that still arises. Of course, the question of you know the support system and the world events. The Chinese in 62 found a gap between world events where everybody was focused towards Cuba and the missile crisis, and they took advantage of that particular game. Of course,
Yeah.
there's today a lot of people in India have looked at it and said, okay, there's a war in Ukraine. Players are pretty much the same, and there's a lot of predominant focus. So if the war actually in Ukraine deteriorates to some sort of a semi-direct issue between the Russians and the West, that will be a great opportunity for China to hit out onto its two main issues. One would be India, and the second would be Taiwan. Leaving Taiwan separately, how far do you think that argument is feasible, sir?
Well, I don't think China would risk an broader armed conflict with India. It would be just too disastrous if they even tried. Taiwan is a different issue because it is something that Xi Jinping has said that during his presidency, Taiwan will be reunited with the fatherland. So, uh, and of course, there's been a lot of concern in Taiwan about this issue as well. Is China going to take advantage of what's happening in Ukraine and then invade Taiwan? But that doesn't really make sense either because Taiwan is heavily defended and increasingly so. But it's not only the United States that's behind Taiwan. You have to look at the whole chain of islands from Japan, from Hokkaido in the north, the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, down to the Philippines, South China Sea, Indonesia. There's a whole line of chain of islands there, which is a kind of defense against Chinese expansion eastwards. And a major power there is actually Japan. And you can see how much Japan has built up its self-defense forces, right? Japan doesn't have any military, but they got one of the strongest self-defense forces in the world, one of the best equipped and the technologically most advanced. So, I mean, it is a formidable fighting force if they have to fight. But then it says that they cannot fight unless they have to defend their own territory. They cannot be engaged in foreign conflicts unless they are under attack. But let's say there is a conflict over Taiwan, and the American base on Okinawa is not that far away. No, it is an American base. It is located in Japan. So if the Chinese launch a missile to Okinawa, Japan would have a justification for intervening in the conflict as well. And I think the Chinese are looking at this very carefully. They have to look at the United States, of course, but increasingly, I think, Taiwan. And you can see the relations between Taiwan and China become stronger over the past few years. And it has to do with the exchange of intelligence. No joint military maneuvers, because that doesn't make sense, and Japan cannot really do that. But it is certainly a new alliance there. And if you look at this chain of islands from Hokkaido down to Indonesia, that is the line of defense that the Japanese do not want to see broken. So therefore, Xi Jinping would have to think very carefully before he launches an attack on Taiwan. Let's say he fails, then he's finished. He has to succeed.
Hmm. The scope for actually doing anything else is very limited. I have last two questions for you, sir. In 62, one another thing that we noticed was, as you said, that the Chinese had issues within China, and they wanted to externalize that particular thing. And today, again, we are in a situation where the Chinese are weakened from within, from what you would term them about 8, 10 years ago. They've got massive issues in terms of social issues, which weren't something very prominent within China and was not spoken about. How do you see that impacting Chinese foreign policy?
I think it will, because if you look at what happened, I mean, Xi Jinping launched this Belt and Road Initiative, this multi-trillion-dollar uh, global investment development project. This turned out to be a complete failure. I mean, they they're tightening the belt, to put it mildly, and they may then try to concentrate on their immediate neighbors instead and try to gain influence there. And that we can see is happening, countries like Laos, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan. So there will be much more towards the neighborhood, and that of course will increase tensions in the region as well. But then, because China doesn't really have the resources to implement this massive project, and then China has gone through the COVID-19 pandemic in a way that has really hurt the economy. But for a couple of years, China was basically at a standstill, and a country of China's size and the size of its economy can't really afford that. So it's a much poorer, weaker China that has emerged from uh, the COVID crisis and, of course, also international financial problems. And in that situation, yes, I think that it's quite possible that they will try to do something. But I think if you look at from the Chinese perspective again, what could possibly unite the Chinese nation? I don't think India hostility towards India. I think it would be Taiwan, because they're even very progressive Chinese seem to believe that Taiwan should be part of China. And it's a breakaway province and all that. There's no reason, there's no right to be independent. And that is something that could unite both supporters and opponents of Xi Jinping if he decided to do something decisive about Taiwan. But that is a high risk venture. Because, I mean, what would happen if both the United States and Japan come to the defense of Taiwan? The Chinese would not be able to capture that island.
They're talking about building that island into a porcupine today, so that's going to be interesting for Chinese to actually fathom. My last question to you, sir: How did the you know the The Chinese threat towards India has manifested in multiple facets. After 62, India also had a war with Pakistan, where it is now known that it was a collusive threat, where the Pakistanis needed to come into India and the Chinese would put additional pressure on our boundaries. But the entire thing flattered when the Pakistanis failed. You said that the Chinese are going to focus towards closer to their region rather than with the BRI, whatever they can salvage, if I may. And when we see that telltale sign, you again have Pakistan in the forefront. You've got Nepal, as you said, and Nepal is a dangerous thing for India because if they come down to the Tarai regions, I mean, you're right there in the central part of India. So we see that we see these issues with Burma, uh, with the coup and everything like that. Of course, there have been mixed signals coming out from there, and we also see the pressure that is being put on Bhutan. So we today look at the Chinese perspective as not a direct threat, but it's also the indirect threat combined with it. And it's
Oh,
not
absolutely.
Pakistan itself. So how do you look at that situation in comparison to what we had in 62 and going forward, your opinion, sir?
But China has become a little bit more sophisticated now than it was in 62. Remember, then in 62, there was an orthodox communist dictatorship with Mao Zedong as the god, right? Today, it is a more advanced society when it comes to education, when it comes to perception of the outside world, and even in the way they conduct their diplomacy. So there won't be a repeat of 62 in that sense. But what we can see is a gradual expansion of Chinese influence in its border or frontier areas. There you mentioned Nepal, absolutely. I mean, they're making big inroads there. And then you actually cross the watershed of the Himalayas. And from India's point of view, that is extremely dangerous because that is the line of defense, the northern line of defense for India. And that is, of course, why India considers that the McMahon line should be the border between India and China in Arunachal. Then you have Bhutan as well, which is the only neighboring country with which China does not maintain official diplomatic relations. But look at that. Again, they're using the border issue. There's endless border talks. I mean, what is there to talk about? What is happening? 16 times, 18 times? I even lost track of it. And that is a way for China to maintain relations with Bhutan in lieu of having an embassy there, which would probably not happen. And you see, I was in Bhutan a couple of years ago, and I was quite amazed to see what the Chinese were actually doing there. I mean, they were sending acrobats and circus performers and football teams. And I said it's a joke that it's only a matter of time before they put a panda in a plane and fly it to Bhutan as well. And so, I mean, making, they make all these efforts to strengthen their relations with their immediate neighbors and to expand that influence further, beyond the actual border areas. And Myanmar or Burma is, of course, very interesting there because it's the only country, neighboring country, that provides China with a direct and safe access to the Indian Ocean. There are three countries which border China which have access to the Indian Ocean. You've got India, but forget about that. You've got Pakistan, yes. But then the Karakoram Highway is the most dangerous highway in the world. It's far out in the west, in the wide west of China. You've got the problem with Xinjiang, that sort of thing. Politically, Pakistan is in many ways more volatile than Myanmar because of the politics at the top level and the leadership. Right? Whereas Burma is almost a natural outlet for China if they want to reach the Indian Ocean for trade, for all sort of economic, political influence and so on. Just look at the map of China. It's very different from India. India, you've got a very long west coast, a long east coast. You've got railways crisscrossing the country. Uh, China is a huge inland empire. The comparatively short coastline for such a big country. And the country is totally dependent on export for its economic growth. It's an export-oriented economy, much more than India is. And therefore, they need outlets to the oceans. And right now, the only one they got is actually, yeah, because Pacific, but that's a different story. Because they contested South China Sea. So therefore, in order to avoid the contested South China Sea and the congested Straits of Malacca, Then Burma, Myanmar, the Myanmar corridor is exactly what China is looking for and what they've been trying for years to achieve. And that is still continuing. That is what China is playing all sort of games in Myanmar. They are having good relations with the military junta and with the armed opposition, certain groups anyway, as well. It's not clear. You cannot say they're on one side or the other. They're on China's own side. What actually is it serves their long-term interests. That is actually to keep Burma reasonably unstable, but not chaos, because then you get refugees and that sort of thing. I certainly would not like to see, a stable, solid, democratic federal Burma. No, no way. It would not be in China's interest. China would be the first country to lose if that ever happened. If that ever happened, it is much better to have these contacts with the various ethnic rebel armies, with the government, and the kind of degree of instability which they can control. That is in China's interest. And China's main interest there is to get this outlet to the Indian Ocean. And it's also an inlet, as a Chinese official once actually put it to me, because they're still dependent on fossil fuel and oil from the Middle East. And right now it goes through the Straits of Malacca. It's very vulnerable. So they actually already built pipelines for gas and for oil through Burma up to Yunnan, China. So therefore, I would say that Burma is of utmost strategic importance to China. And that is why Western countries can talk about democracy as much as they want. But that's not really relevant when you're looking at the domestic situation in Burma and the geopolitical interest that China has.
Absolutely, sir. I think, but you brought out a very interesting point, and if I just may put it in another way, that China has chosen these interesting corrupt regimes to manifest their dreams, because they don't care if the money goes into somebody's brother-in-law's pockets, as long as they have the control and they have their purpose met. So China's interest number one, and that's how we see, that's a pattern that we see going around with the BRI as well. If you see, the countries that the Chinese have gone into are all highly corrupt and highly singular thought process, authoritarian sort of countries, where it's just, that's it, and they don't care if
Yeah.
the money is here, there, or everywhere.
No, and most of it is to the countries as such. They are loans which have to be repaid. But then
Yeah,
there's, of course, pocket money going into the pockets of the rulers of those countries.
yeah.
And that is what the Chinese way of expanding its influence across the globe looks like.
So this has been an interesting conversation. I think we started at 62 and we've brought about how that 62 has changed the entire subcontinent and the region. Because a lot of people kind of ignore that as an isolated incident. It's not. I mean, the Chinese keep throwing that in our face, if I may, because
Yeah.
that's something that they can wave across. They've got probably nothing else to do. But 62 changed the geopolitics of this region, and 62 also changed the Indo-China relations to a point of I won't say no return, but to the point that they stand in today. Because it's if you look at it, the relations as far as the border dispute and everything that concerns is the same. There is what it was in 62. Of course, there were some memorandum signs for some confidence building measures and this and that. Today, all that is out the window, and you're back at the same kind of tensed up environment on the borders as what it was at that time as well. So that's my understanding. But thank you so much, sir, for talking to me. And of course, your work is absolutely brilliant. I've been reading quite a bit of stuff that you've written and stuff. It's a different perspective than what the conventional history, as I said, and especially you also brought out how Maxwell's history was uh, put across to us as how it is, but there's the reality, of course, stands on the opposite helm of reality. I'd like to thank you and, of course, request you to be, you know, be a part of this series, and so that we can learn from you and your experiences in the future. And probably I'd like to do a show with you on Myanmar, because I know you've got a very, very long history with them, and you understand the entire game in that country very, very well. Till then, sir, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.